She has a career most people would kill for. Corner office, 6-figure salary, full autonomy over her schedule. She vacations twice a year, owns her home, and nobody tells her what to do. By every measurable standard, she has won. And yet, if you sat down with her over coffee and steered the conversation toward the state of her life, she would eventually say it. The system is still stacked against me. Women are still not treated equally. I have to work twice as hard just to be taken half as seriously. And the wild part, she genuinely believes it. This isn't a video about dismissing those feelings or telling women to just be grateful. This is Psyche Shift, and we go deeper than that. Because when you actually understand the psychology underneath this pattern, it changes the entire conversation. Here's something that will sound strange at first. The more you achieve, the more your brain has to work to maintain a sense of threat. Stay with me. There's a concept in psychology called identity protective cognition. It basically means that our beliefs don't just float freely in our heads. They're woven into our sense of who we are. And when a belief is tied to your identity, you don't update it when the evidence changes. You protect it. You filter reality through it. Now think about what happens when a woman has spent years, maybe decades, building her worldview around the idea that the world is set against her. That belief didn't form in a vacuum. A lot of women experience very real barriers in earlier careers, in family dynamics, in how they were treated by institutions. That lived experience got encoded into their identity. It became the lens. The problem is, lenses don't automatically swap out just because circumstances change. So even when the career materializes, the salary lands, the independence becomes real. The lens stays. She still sees through the glass that was shaped by old pain. And here's what most people miss. That lens doesn't just color how she sees the world. It actively searches for confirmation. The brain is a pattern recognition machine, and if your deepest identity says, "I am someone who faces unfair resistance," your brain will find that resistance everywhere. A passed-over promotion becomes proof. A slightly lower raise than a male colleague becomes proof. A dismissive comment in a meeting becomes proof. The emotional experience is entirely real. But the interpretive framework feeding that experience might be outdated by years. Think about this. A scientist in the 1980s might have built their entire career around a theory that has since been disproven. Do they immediately abandon the theory when new data comes in? Almost never. They rationalize. They find exceptions. They reinterpret the new data to fit the old model. Not because they're stupid, but because their identity is fused to that framework. The exact same thing happens with belief systems that form around oppression. So what do you do with this? If you're someone who cares about the women in your life, or if you are that woman, the first step isn't argument. It isn't presenting statistics. It's recognizing that you're not dealing with a logic problem. You're dealing with an identity problem. And identity shifts require something far more patient than a debate. Here's where it gets genuinely fascinating. Even when someone has objectively more than most people on the planet, satisfaction isn't measured against the planet. It's measured against the most visible comparison group nearby. Psychologists call this relative deprivation. It's the reason a person earning $200,000 a year can feel financially struggling, because they're surrounded by people earning $400,000. Absolute wealth is almost irrelevant to how rich or poor you feel. What matters is the gap between you and whoever you're mentally comparing yourself to. Now layer that onto gender. A highly educated, high-earning woman in a professional environment doesn't compare herself to women in the 1950s. She doesn't compare herself to women in countries where education is actively denied. She compares herself to the most successful men in her immediate orbit. And the moment she spots a man who got a promotion faster, or got taken more seriously in a boardroom, or seems to navigate workplace politics with less friction, that gap, however small, becomes the entire story. The objective gains become invisible. The relative gap becomes everything, and social media has turned this into a full-time psychological assault. Every scroll surfaces another story about a woman being wronged, underpaid, dismissed. Algorithms are designed to surface content that generates emotional response, and outrage and grievance generate enormous emotional response. So the feed becomes a curated highlight reel of every gender-related injustice happening anywhere on Earth. Delivered daily, directly into the palm of a hand. Let me show you how this actually works in a real brain. Imagine a woman named Priya. She's 38. She runs a marketing department, earns well, has full flexibility in her schedule, and genuinely loves her work. On any given Tuesday, her lived experience is mostly positive, but she opens Instagram for 20 minutes before bed and sees 3 reels. One about the gender pay gap, one about a viral story of a woman being talked over in a meeting, one about a male CEO who was promoted while a female counterpart wasn't. That's 20 minutes. By the time Priya closes the app, her nervous system has been through a completely different Tuesday than the one she actually lived. And if you asked her that night how women are treated in the workplace, she would answer from the Tuesday her algorithm built, not the one she experienced. This isn't weakness. This is just how human brains work. We remember emotional experiences. We update beliefs from vivid stories. And the digital environment we all live in is engineered to exploit that biology. So what do? Honestly, the most powerful thing is something almost no one talks about. Audit the information environment. Not in a don't read the news way, but with genuine intentionality. If every source of information you consume is filtered through a single ideological lens, your brain is going to mirror that lens back at you. Priya isn't less oppressed because she consumes that content, but she's more likely to feel oppressed regardless of what's actually happening around her. Now here's the piece that almost nobody talks about, and this is where it gets psychologically uncomfortable. There is a very specific type of social reward available to people who publicly identify as oppressed. And that reward is powerful enough to maintain the belief even when personal experience no longer supports it. This isn't cynical. It's not saying people are faking it. It's recognizing that human beings are social creatures who respond to incentives, and one of the most powerful incentives on Earth is belonging, moral status, and being taken seriously. When a woman expresses that she feels systematically disadvantaged, she gets something. She gets sympathy. She gets community. She gets moral weight in a conversation. In certain social circles, identifying with a marginalized narrative grants real social capital, access to networks, political identity, a kind of automatic credibility when speaking on certain issues. Now compare that to what happens if that same woman stands up and says, actually, I've had a pretty fair shot. She doesn't get the same warmth. She might get called naive, or a traitor to the cause, or accused of benefiting from privilege while ignoring systemic problems. The social cost of exiting the oppression narrative can be genuinely high. Think about that for a second. The incentive structure rewards staying in the narrative. It penalizes leaving it. This is not a conspiracy. It's just sociology. Every in-group has beliefs that carry social rewards for members who hold them. What makes this particular pattern worth examining is how invisible it is to the people inside it. The belief feels like observation. It feels like looking at reality clearly. The social scaffolding holding it up is completely invisible from the inside. Here's a real pattern you might recognize. Take a group of women in a professional setting, say a mastermind group or a leadership retreat. The moment someone starts talking about gender barriers, watch what happens to the room. There's a social gravity toward agreement. Pushback feels like dismissal. Adding a personal story of unfair treatment earns visible warmth and nods. The group dynamic itself reinforces the framework. Over and over, meeting after meeting. Nobody orchestrated this. Nobody is manipulating anyone. But the cultural permission structure makes one emotional stance far more socially rewarding than another. So what do? If you actually want to think clearly about this, and this applies to anyone inside any identity-based narrative, you have to create some separation between your social belonging and your beliefs. You have to be able to ask, is this true independent of does believing this make me feel connected? Those are two completely different questions, and when they get fused together, honest thinking becomes almost impossible. Here's the thing about progress. It can become psychologically invisible if the standard of what counts as enough keeps shifting. In the 1960s, the fight was for the right to hold certain jobs at all. In the 1980s, it was for equal pay within those jobs. In the 2000s, it became about representation at senior levels. Today, it's often about invisible dynamics, tone, unconscious bias, microaggressions. Each generation of progress dissolves into the foundation, and a new, more refined grievance takes its place. This isn't necessarily wrong. Social progress should keep raising its standards, but there's a psychological consequence. If the definition of oppression continuously expands to encompass subtler and subtler experiences, then by definition, no amount of material progress will ever feel like enough. A woman can have a seat at every table, earn equal pay, hold the corner office, and still experience something that gets coded as oppression because the framework has expanded to include emotional experiences that are nearly impossible to audit objectively. Was that comment dismissive because of my gender, or because he's just a dismissive person? Was I passed over because of bias, or because someone else made a stronger case? The new territory of grievance is almost entirely subjective, and subjective territory can never be resolved through objective progress. Let me put a name to this. It's what researchers sometimes call the victimhood treadmill. The goalposts shift just fast enough that arrival is never possible. Not because progress isn't happening, but because the emotional benefit of the narrative requires there to always be something left to overcome. This isn't unique to gender. You'll see this same pattern in economic class narratives, racial grievance frameworks, generational identity. Anywhere a community has built shared identity around a history of disadvantage. Progress becomes hard to absorb because absorbing it means releasing an identity that has become foundational to how the group sees itself. And here's the genuine tension in all of this. Some of the things that now get labelled as oppression are real. Unconscious bias is real. Cultural conditioning is real. Tone policing in meetings is real. None of that is invented. But when the framework has expanded to encompass everything from overt discrimination all the way down to conversational dynamics, the word oppression loses its ability to distinguish between something serious and something minor. And when a word loses that distinction, it loses its power to guide us towards what actually needs fixing. So what do? Whether you're navigating this personally or in relationship to someone you care about, the most useful question isn't, is there any injustice here? There almost always is somewhere. The more useful question is the scale of grievance proportional to the scale of the actual barrier? Because that's where honest thinking lives. Not in denying that friction exists, but in refusing to let small friction carry the emotional weight of systemic oppression. Pull back from every framework we've talked about. Step outside the politics of it for a moment. Because underneath all of this, the identity protection, the comparison spiral, the social incentives, the moving goalposts, there's something more human. And it's this. The oppression narrative gives people a story for their pain. Pain needs a story. Humans are meaning-making machines, and when we feel unfulfilled, anxious, stuck, or like something is fundamentally wrong, we need somewhere to put that. We need a cause that makes the feeling make sense. For a woman who has genuinely achieved a lot but still feels something is missing, still feels the restlessness, the quiet disappointment, the sense that the life she built isn't filling her the way she thought it would, the external world is a much safer place to locate that pain than the internal one. Because if the problem is the system, the answer is changing the system. That's something you can fight for. It has a community, it has language, it has momentum. But if the problem is internal, if the emptiness comes from a misalignment between the life you built and the life your deeper self actually wanted, that is a much lonelier and scarier diagnosis. There's no movement for it. Nobody marches for I made choices that don't actually reflect who I am. Think about this carefully. This is not about dismissing real barriers. It is about recognizing that some percentage of the energy pointed outward at systems, at men, at institutions, is really a deflected conversation about something much closer to home, about identity, about meaning, about whether the metrics of success that were handed to us at 20 actually match the human being we've grown into by 40. And the women who eventually find their way through this, not to some politically convenient conclusion, but to genuine peace, they almost always describe the same shift. They stopped measuring themselves against an external story of what they were supposed to have by now. They got honest about what they actually wanted, and they found that the answer had very little to do with whether the system was fair. None of this is about whether discrimination exists. It does. None of this is about dismissing the genuine frustrations of women navigating real institutional friction. Those frustrations have legitimate roots. This is about the specific psychological trap of letting a narrative of victimhood become so fused with your identity that material success can't touch your emotional experience of the world. Because here's the honest truth. The most powerful thing any person, man or woman, can do is separate their sense of self from the story of what was done to them. That is not naive. That is not complicity. That is not pretending the world is perfect. It is refusing to outsource your peace to circumstances you cannot control. The women who carry the most genuine authority in any room are almost never the ones performing grievance. They're the ones who moved through it, who took the real injuries seriously, did the real work to process them, and came out the other side without needing the world to confirm their worth before they could feel it. That shift doesn't happen from the outside in. It never did. It happens exactly where you'd expect it to. Right at the edge of a story you finally decide to stop telling.